do with purpose. For example, you can't say anything about purpose, because purpose is all God, comes from God. Newton believed in God. Newton was actually an alchemist. Newton was an alchemist. He studied alchemical texts and wrote them for 20 years. His heirs have actually disavowed this. They've only been published in the 20th century. And Kepler, who discovered the laws of planetary motion, was an astrologer. See, astronomy and astrology used to be one science, just like alchemy and chemistry. The chemistry took only the physical part of the alchemical tradition and relegated the psychic part, the spiritual part, to the underground. And astronomy did the same thing, took only the physical measurements of the stars and relegated all the astrology, how it relates to human beings, to superstition, to the margins. So astrology never really developed beyond the astronomy of the 16th century. It deals actually with the planets and with the zodiac as it was then understood. But before that, there was an integrated science. It was an integrated worldview. Why should they be separate? It's one world, after all. It's not two different realms of knowledge, but it's become two different realms of knowledge. But now, and that's part of the transpersonal movement, I think, is its great merit, because it is possible to have a scientific approach to worlds of spirit and consciousness and all that. Meaning, it's possible to be scientific, to make replicable observations, repeated observations, and so marriage and the religion and science can get that got divorced can get married again. The one area that I'm also, besides consciousness studies, that I teach in is called ecological or eco-psychology, or I call it green psychology. And it's the psychology of our relationship to the earth, our human relationship to the earth. And you could say that that's transpersonal, but it doesn't actually it's not generally considered part of transpersonal. And to begin, that's, I think, a function of more or less an accidental function. But it is transpersonal because you're talking about how we're actually part of an ecosystem, so our identity is part of that ecosystem, not just an individual. But mainstream psychology tends to assume, including transpersonal and humanistic, tends to assume that interesting things for psychologists is what's intrapsychic or interpersonal, or intergroup, let's say, social psychology groups. Culture. But that's also true of the whole worldview. See, we have a worldview that says, well, there's the material world, or we call it the environment, and it's sort of backdrop for human beings. We still actually have the idea that human beings are superior to the natural world, which was a religious idea. It comes out of the Bible. You shall have dominion. But science adopted it uncritically and falsely. Actually, when you think about it, there's no evidence to say that human beings are superior in some kind of a way, ultimate way. I mean, you can talk about specifics. There are differences. And there's a lot of research goes on. Well, humans have language, can communicate. Well, people have done all these studies about animals could communicate very clearly. They don't use English words, but who said that was the only way to communicate? Even trees communicate, They communicate by pheromones and chemicals and ants and fish and all kinds of animals. Birds suddenly communicate and learn, can have learned behavior. And of course, we say, oh, animals only, humans are the only ones who have consciousness. It's just stated as a statement. There's no evidence for it. It's not a scientific statement. They don't have human consciousness. Of course they don't. Why should they? But who's to say? Who's to say, right? And the traditional people, the animistic, see, animism is like, shamanism is the practice, you could say, and animism is the worldview. Animism says everything's animated by spirit. Anima is spirit, or soul. Some people say animism means you're projecting human qualities onto nature. That's not what it is. It's perceiving the inherent intelligence, the living intelligence. What traditional people call spirits, I would call, Jungians might call symbols or archetypes. I don't say that. I said it's a living intelligence. Nature has its own intelligence. You can't just have some evolutionary idea of random mutation and natural selection. That's not enough to explain the amazing complexities. And why should you? believe that just out of an article of faith. Why not be open to the possibility that there is intelligent design? And it's the same thing with a shamanic view. Everything is animated, not only plants and animals, but rocks and the whole earth itself. You see, and you have the Gaia theory, that the whole earth itself is like a living organism. Well, if other living organisms have a consciousness, well, so does the earth. And then in fact, you have these ancient religious ideas that say, well, Mother Earth, Father Sky and Father Sun and Mother Earth, and all the planets are named after deities, after all. I mean, people weren't stupid. They were smart people too. They could think, they could make observations just like we can. They weren't, and still do. So they're reporting their observations and saying, okay, we'll call the consciousness of the Earth, scientists are now calling the Gaia principle, the Gaia theory, for which there's all kinds of detailed evidence, how the detailed mechanism, how it's a self-regulating, homeostatic, self-regenerating, self-maintaining, integrated system, of coupled organisms with the environment, all integrated. They said Gaia, Mother Earth. I think ecopsychology, the subtitle of my book, Green Psychology, is the transformation of the relationship between humans and nature. Because what I argue, along with many other psychologists, ecopsychologists have looked at that the environmental crisis, the destruction of habitats, the extinction of species, all that, those things are going on. It's a human psychological problem, because it's humans that are doing it. They're not being done from Mars or outer space or accidental climate change or anything like that. It's all human. So it must be, and it's destructive, and humans see that it's destructive, and we don't seem to be able to stop it. So what is that? That's a psychological problem. When you look at individual psychopathology, I have a whole chapter on what do we learn from individual psychopathology. That's like an addictive behavior. An addict is like keeps doing something that's destructive to their health, their family, their work, everything like that. They can't stop doing it. It's like that. We're addicted to fossil fuels. We know it's destroying the air, and it's going to run out, and we need more and more of it, and we're like hooked on it. We don't seem to be able to stop it. It's like an addictive society. So then we look at, or people like Thomas Berry, whom I like very much. He said he's a theologian who became interested in the environment and Gaia, and he says he now calls himself a geologian. And he wrote a book called The Universe Story, how the whole universe, it's kind of going back to the idea of the ancient astrologers and the ancient alchemists. It's like, okay, not only is there a material world in there, but we're part of this world, and so our psyche is affected by it and interactive with it. So we're part of the universe story. How could we not be? We don't have the possibility of assuming the position of a detached outside observer. We're right in the thick of it. We can observe and we can participate at the same time. And he says that our civilization has become sort of autistic. He says like we don't seem to relate. We're not experiencing what he called the dream of the earth. He wrote a whole book of the dream of the earth. What is the dream of the earth? Or what's the universe story? How has it evolved to come to this? Not in the sense that we're superior and we therefore have the right to lord it over. See, that's the common assumption. We're superior. We own the place, basically. It's there for us to use. Right? Resources, all resources. How can we use them? Or we might say, well, we use them for human betterment. We'll get drugs to cure cancer and all that. But the deep ecologists would say, wait a minute. Who made that law? Who made that up? They say it's anthropocentrism. It's like human-centered. It's like ethnocentrism. It's a prejudice. We're not superior. We're part of the earth. And then it turns out that the Native Americans have been saying that all along. Hey, we're part of the earth. It's all our relations. We don't own the place. We're not superior. There's all our relations. So we're mutually interdependent. I don't call it a systems view. Everything's interconnected and interdependent. The parts all depend on one another for the maintenance of the whole. So it's wrong for one part to say we're the rulers of this place. It's like as wrong as it would be for one organ system in the body, say the brain or the nose, to decide it's superior and it's therefore in charge of all the others and gets to use all the others. We call that disease. It's an illness. It's a planetary illness. People say the planet is ill and we've made it ill. And Lovelock even has a name for it. He says we're infestation of primates on the planet. Disseminated primatemia. disseminated primatemia. It's an infestation of parasitical primates on this planet Gaia. We're sucking it dry. We're not going to kill the host. You can't kill a planet, but we're ruining large sections of it, and we're driving other species to extinction. In my classes, I try to track back, what are the major turning points in which we as a civilization got so separated from the natural world. And I distinguish 5 major turning points, and many other people have written on all of this. The last one being the scientific revolution in the 16th, 17th century, which was a major, the development of this materialistic worldview. And then it goes back to the beginnings of Christianity, or rather the beginnings of monotheism. Because the monotheistic traditions, all 3 of them tend to have the idea of a transcendent deity, a transcendent creator deity. And transcendent means above and beyond. It's sort of out in heaven somewhere, and there's a sort of a big gap. And in Christianity particularly, the mundane world tends to be seen as devilish. It's actually called the realm of, the devil was called the Lord of this world in early Christianity. So, and that goes along with the idea of original sin. The flesh is corrupt, the material world, everything is corrupt. And to be spiritual, to be Christ-like and Christian and spiritual and after death and so on, you go to heaven. It's sort of up there, beyond the material world. And that's very different, completely different from the shamanic animistic view. To them, the spiritual and the natural are the same. In the Judeo-Christian world, they like to go in opposite directions. We think spiritual, we think up, heavenward. We think natural, we think down. It's down in the mud, down by the feet and the stomach and the pelvis and so forth, earthly things. I use the analogy of dissociation. It's a disconnect. We lead lives of conspicuous consumption and burning oil and polluting the environment and so forth. Then we might go and but we go into nature, and we go in the country by the ocean and the forest, but then we go back to our everyday life. We were participating in huge systems and corporations and so forth that are all this kind of technological destruction. Industrial technological civilization is basically destroying the earth. It's shredding the life support system of not so much human beings too, but all these other species of plants and animals that are being driven to extinction. That's a horrible, horrible thing. Extinction is terminal, it's irreversible. You can't bring them back. It's not like killing somebody. Extinguishing a species is such a phenomenal impoverishment of our life. So, tracing back this disconnect, so the transcendental monotheism is part of it. And I'm not blaming Christianity. I'm not trying to say that. I'm not saying, as others are also not saying, Christianity is to blame for pollution or environmental destruction. They're saying these are aspects of our worldview that didn't lead us to protect the environment. Unlike, we think this conception of spirituality as being somehow transcendent is so ingrained in the Western worldview. It wasn't my view too until I started thinking about it and really looking at it. I always thought, well, of course, that's the way it is. You go into a cathedral and your eyes are taken upward. You think of heaven as up, and up in the body, like the head is more like closer to heaven than the stomach, say, or the genitals. And but then you look at the worldview of Native Americans or traditional indigenous people, and they don't have that at all. They say everything is animated by spirits. You communicate them. We call it Brother Bear, sacred gods and goddesses. And similarly with the polytheistic religions, and including the polytheistic religions of our own ancestors in classical times. So the Greeks and the Romans and the Nordic people, and I wrote a whole book about Nordic European mythology, I'm a Nordic European myself, called The Well of Remembrance. And they have all these myths and shamanic imagery of looking into the well of remembrance and drinking from the well of remembrance in order to remember your history and your connection to the earth and where you came from and your ancestry. your evolutionary ancestry, and the God chemical tradition, and relegated the psychic part, the spiritual part, to the underground. And astronomy did the same thing, took only the physical measurements of the stars and relegated all the astrology, how it relates to human beings, to superstition, to the margins. So astrology never really developed beyond the astronomy of the 16th century. It deals actually with the planets and with the zodiac as it was then understood. But before that, there was an integrated science. It was an integrated worldview. With purpose, for example, you can't say anything about purpose, because purpose is all God, comes from God. Newton believed in God. Newton was actually an alchemist. Newton was an alchemist. He studied alchemical texts and wrote them for 20 years. His heirs have actually disavowed this. They've only been published in the 20th century. And Kepler, who discovered the laws of planetary motion, was an astrologer. See, astronomy and astrology used to be one science, just like alchemy and chemistry. The chemistry took only the physical part of the again. The one area that I'm also, besides consciousness studies, that I teach in is called ecological or eco-psychology, or I call it green psychology. And it's the psychology of our relationship to the earth, our human relationship to the earth. And you could say that that's transpersonal, but it doesn't actually even, it's not generally considered. Why should they be separate? It's one world after all. It's not two different realms of knowledge, but it's become two different realms of knowledge. But now, and that's part of the transpersonal movement, I think, is its great merit, because it is possible to have a scientific approach to worlds of spirit and consciousness and all that. Meaning, it's possible to be scientific, to make replicable observations, repeated observations, and so marriage and the religion and science can get that got divorced can get married. That's part of transpersonal, and again, that's I think a function of more or less an accidental function. But it is transpersonal because you're talking about how we're actually part of an ecosystem, so our identity is part of that ecosystem, not just an individual. But mainstream psychology tends to assume, including transpersonal and humanistic, tends to assume that interesting things about for psychologists is what's intrapsychic or interpersonal, or intergroup, let's say, social psychology groups.